joined from Israel by Haviv, Rettig, Gur. Good morning, Haviv. I greatly appreciate your joining me this morning. Welcome to the Hugh Hewitt Show.
Thank you for having me, Hugh. It's good to be here.
Years ago, Stephanie, our mutual friend, recommended that you come on, but I've had Ambassador Oren all these years from Israel, and I didn't think I needed a second. But after listening to you on Dan Senor's podcast and on the Times of Israel podcast, I said, I got to talk to this guy myself. You're really quite remarkable, Haviv. Will you tell the audience how long you've been doing this for? You are with the Times of Israel. You're their political correspondent, their conflicts correspondent. But give them a little background if it's the first time they've heard you.
I've been in journalism since 2005. I actually got my first job in journalism during the disengagement from Gaza, and mostly English language journalism. English is my second language, but I spent some childhood years, quite a few, in the United States. That's it. I'm born and raised in Jerusalem, served in the Army, pretty much done journalism since college.
I have appreciated your calm but very blunt assessment of everything. And I have 8 questions in 33 minutes to do it, so I'm going to get at it. First, your assessment of the hostage release negotiation that is proceeding, that was approved by the cabinet 35-3 last night on the recommendation of the IDF, Mossad, and Shin Bet.
Yes. There are a few things we need to understand about this deal. The first thing, the government voted overwhelmingly. I think it was 35-3. Cabinet members voted overwhelmingly to accept it. They voted to accept it, including some people whose initial public reaction, they put out press releases when it was first announced a day or two ago, was to reject it. And the reason was that the commander, the security services that you just mentioned, all said that, in fact, it would also help Israeli security. We're talking about getting out the most sensitive of the hostages, children and their mothers. There was an Israeli demand that was accepted by Hamas. Again, accepted by Hamas doesn't mean much. We have to see if it's implemented. But that was accepted by Hamas not to split up families. So far, when Hamas did release a couple of hostages at the beginning, they left family members inside. They tried to keep as many families as possible as part of the campaign on the government, the pressure campaign, because that's, of course, what they're holding the hostages for. So Hamas released together. And my assessment is that the great, overwhelming, overpowering question hanging over this is will it be easy to get back to the war? Because if this is an end to the war, if this is the beginning of a much larger international campaign, then that's a disaster. Every single security service has said, absolutely. I am confident that it is. And so I am very much in support of this deal.
All right. Now, Haviv, I want to go from that to your podcast yesterday, The Times of Israel. It was the very best assessment of what Israel thinks about the world. And I've been repeating it. But when you explain that Zionists just don't give a damn what other people think about what they're doing, and when Israelis just don't care about world opinion, because their opinion of what a Jew is and does is not going to change. It hit me between the eyes. You're exactly right. Would you explain that to people, why maybe Israel's terrible public diplomacy is actually good public diplomacy?
Yeah, it doesn't come from bravado. It's not because we're so brave and courageous and macho and tall and handsome. Obviously we are, but that's not where it comes from. But where it comes from is something very deep. The Zionist movement is a response, beginning about 140 years ago, to the fact that nothing Jews ever did, nowhere Jews ever turned, seemed to be safe for them. They became capitalists and anti-communists, and they were accused of being rapacious capitalists. And when they became communists, because communism promised equality and to solve all the world's problems, they were accused of being secret capitalists. And accused, I mean, by the top leadership of wherever they were, not accused by some, random bigot. And everywhere they turned, certainly in 20th century Europe, they found that they were not enough. In modern America, I have sat on Zoom calls with Jewish college students, very nervous ones. I couldn't help them much. I'm not an American, despite the accent. I have never been on an American college campus as a student. But what I heard from them was to the left, we're not white enough, we're too white. And to the particular kind of bigot that sits on the far right, we're not white enough. And I don't know how white I should be to just feel comfortable, right? And that is such a classic Jewish statement from the 20th century. It's a shame it's still being said in the 21st. Zionism's response to that was basically to say, you can't be enough. What the anti-Semite is doing with you, it has nothing to do with you, the real Jew. What an anti-Semite does with you is turn you into the cartoon they need to work through for their own insanity. And so ignore them. Do not justify yourself, because you can never win. Israel now in Gaza faces a war that is unlike any war any army has ever faced. There have been standing armies. That Hamas is not a standing army. It's also not quite a terror group, because it controls territory. It has dug in ways that ISIS never could in Mosul, for example, and it has features of a standing army, but it also has features of a terror group. And nobody has quite solved this problem called Hamas, and Israel's now trying to, and the world will say it's a terrible thing. The world doesn't offer us better solutions, other ways to uproot Hamas from within Gaza. And so the Israelis genuinely feel like the hatred is not something they can control, and so they ignore it, just like Zionists have done for 140 years.
Now, Haviv, I'm an Irish Catholic Zionist, and you're going to find bunches of different Zionists running all over America because we believe in Israel and we believe in its absolute right to exist. And as Dr. Arn told me yesterday, if it doesn't have a right to exist, none of the countries of the Middle East have a right to exist, because they were all formed after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. But we're never going to explain that to anyone. And I found myself asking myself, I want to ask you, in the adult population, or the population 16 and older, how many minds can actually be changed on this issue? Or do people arrive at adulthood with an opinion that can no longer be moved and we just have to accept it?
You mean in the West, in the United States, or around the world? In
the West, especially in the United States.
My impression of it is that there are diehard, people who feel deep affinity and loyalty to one side. Those are a minority on all sides. And most people are just regular people going around about their day. And if something happens, something is sort of put on their agenda, the images coming out of Gaza of civilian suffering, for example, that will tilt them. Not powerfully, gently, slowly, that will tilt them in one direction or another, because it just seems common sense that that's the kind of thing that shouldn't happen. Most people are winnable, is my impression. Most people can be convinced at all ages. Israel's bad at making the case. Israel's bad at actually clarifying just how horrible Hamas is. I have a list of probably 15 reports by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, all of whom have now been harshly critical of Israel, of the bombing of a hospital and things like that, in which Human Rights Watch lays out that some hospitals that ISIS took over are legitimate military targets, because that's what international law says. If the military force on the other side takes over the hospital for military reasons, purposes, then it is a legitimate target. And B, reports that are damning against Hamas for tormenting, oppressing Palestinians, for enacting a kind of Sharia rule in Gaza that's absolutely horrifying. This is an Amnesty International report from about 8 years ago. It's not, ancient history. All that stuff Israel has not said to the world. In other words, yes, Palestinians will suffer terribly. Hamas is forcing us. It isn't just forcing us to go through Gaza's civilian population to pull it out. It is literally the only thing Hamas has been doing for 15 years, is building those bunkers under the civilian population. Every army in the world has some installations inside cities. Every army in the world has the Israeli army headquarters are in the middle of Tel Aviv. But Hamas is a force where 100% of its military infrastructure, 100% of its fighters, 100% of its rocket launchers are inside civilian populations, next to schools, next to hospitals, intentionally. And so we need to say that, and we need to show it. And we have intelligence, and our enemies have been saying that against Hamas for decades. We're bad at saying that, but I think that kind of thing would be convincing if people really grasped it, if they understood what was happening on the ground.
Now, NBC polling, and I saw the crosstabs, and I believe it, shows that 70% of Democrats, traditionally the party of the greatest support for Israel, but that's no longer the case, 70% of Democrats under the age of 34 are critical of President Biden's handling of the Gaza situation. Now, that's a big envelope. That can mean a lot of different things. It could probably maybe mean they don't think he's strong enough, but I doubt it. What do you think that number portends for American support for Israel in the future?
I think conventional wisdom says that Israel is losing the Democratic Party. I think that if that's true, that would be very sad. I happen to really like America. Israelis speak Hebrew amongst themselves. They're very provincial people. They don't know how much the American discussion of them, what's happening in it, how it looks. I sometimes I like to tell people that when President Obama was elected, he had 70% approval in Israel. The day he was elected, he hadn't yet done anything, but Israelis loved him. And then when President Trump was elected, he had 70% approval in Israel, and he had yet to do anything. So Israelis are just a small people. They speak their own language, right? They don't speak amongst themselves in English or listen in on the conversation overseas. And they love America as a very sort of general impulse, a general sense. And they're not even aware of the culture wars within America. But if we do lose the Democrats, that'd be very sad. But I hate to say it to people who think that, on the other side, that's a very exciting prospect. It won't change much. President Biden just now had a choice. His choice was to let Israel prosecute its war against Hamas with the absolute imminent threat of a massive escalation by Hezbollah and Iran, or without it. To prosecute that war with America making demands as the war progresses, demands that Israel's listening to because it is shipping over the missiles we need, because it is helping us with Iran for the moment, or not listen to the Americans because it's not doing those things. President Biden doesn't get to decide Israeli policy. And if young Democrats think that because Biden is supporting Israel in one way or another, that's why Israel's fighting this war, it's the exact opposite. Israel's fighting a much more careful war, is my estimation. I think it would be fighting a careful war, but it wouldn't be fighting a careful war to the extent that Secretary Blinken wants if America wasn't backing Israel at the same time, if that wasn't part of the consideration for the war. So if you think this war is too aggressive, and that's why you don't like President Biden, you misunderstand what President Biden is doing.
Haviv, I want my audience to understand. I don't like Democrats to win election. I'm a partisan Republican, but I don't want the Democratic Party to stop supporting Israel because Israel is part of the West and our democratic ally. And when blows come, Israel will have our back and we will have Israel's back ally. That's the name of Dr. Oren's book. So when I see 70% of young Democrats, I worry that this virus on the left that is anti-Semitic in part and anti-West in whole is deeply embedded. And I think it's dangerous for me. I think it's dangerous for you. I think it's dangerous for everyone who believes in the West. Do you agree with that assessment?
I'll say this, I think is absolutely true for Israelis. Israelis will love America. Not because America gave us some weapon that, every missile America is currently selling us, we know how to build. Israelis love America because the American world order is the world in which we want to live. The post-war order, not the Soviet one, the other one, is the world that should exist. It is the world, you see there are a lot of Muslims in the West, Muslim immigrants to the West who are all protesting the war now in Muslim capitals. Well, why are they in the West? They're in the West because it's better to be in the West. It's better for ordinary people who want to raise good families, happy families, to live in the West. That West and that world order of safety, maritime safety, general safety, we've just gone through a period, there's a slight uptick in wars lately in the last 5-10 years, but we've just gone through the safest period in the history of humanity. That is the American-led world order, and Israelis love that. So I'll put it real simple. If the left end of the Democratic Party, which if that's true about those kids, then it's not the edge anymore, right? But if the Democratic Party's progressive edge takes over American politics and takes over American foreign policy, Israelis will still love that American world order. And there'll be a lot of bickering with the Americans about just about everything else. In other words, that I think it's unshakable. And that respect for America doesn't come from, some, I don't know what, distant sort of ideological principle. We live and breathe the part of the world that isn't fixed, that isn't the liberal world order that America leads. We appreciate it in a way that I don't know Americans can understand.
I think that's exactly correct. I have a couple more things I want to ask you. the iron resolve, the implacability that you've talked about, both on the Times of Israel podcast and Call Me Back with Dan Senor, do you think Americans understand the well springs of that resolve, part of which at least has got to be the trauma of losing 1,200 civilians and slaughtered massacre victims and 66 KIAs, or it might be higher, I haven't checked the number overnight, which in America would be about 2,000 KIAs in 6 weeks, which we have not experienced maybe since Vietnam's worst week. Do you think Americans understand the iron will of Israel to persevere and achieve victory here?
I hope so. I know that technically that's not an answer to your question, but if they don't, they will. We're going into a 4 or 5 day ceasefire, depending how long Hamas holds up its end of the bargain, and then the war will resume. And what I think some people who want a ceasefire, permanent ceasefire, want to end the conflict, want Hamas to survive, in the case of many of them, I think that they hope that this is an opportunity to up the pressure on Israel, to get images out of Gaza, to create a campaign that's even more intensive, in case anyone's forgotten this war is going on, and to make that very costly for Israel to resume the war. Many Israelis are worried about that and think that it'll make resuming the war harder. I welcome it, because the more pressure comes on Israel, and the more visible that pressure is when Israel nevertheless implacably resumes the war, the clearer the message will be to Hamas. And I need the Palestinian political world to understand what is happening. Israel will be implacable, and Hamas will not be allowed to rule Gaza.
One of the things I have considered, Haviv, and I'm talking with Haviv Rettig, if you're just joining the conversation, correspondent for the Times of Israel, interlocutor with Dan Senor on Call Me Back, is the recognition that if Iran achieves a nuclear weapon, you have to assume they will use it, or that they will give it to Hamas, because what Hamas did was suicidal. And I'm afraid if they had weapons of mass destruction, they would use weapons of mass destruction. Is that your conclusion as well?
My personal conclusion is that we can no longer pretend like there's any clarity that they won't. On October 6th, the Israeli government, the Israeli security services, Israeli intelligence, literally everyone, except for a very small handful of, iconoclasts and critics who turned out to all be correct. But everybody, 99% of the Israeli security echelons, was convinced that Hamas was contained, that Hamas was deterred, that we understood their psychology perfectly. So much so that they had basically dismantled the defensive forces on the ground. On October 8th, the Israelis understood that none of that was true. They had completely miscalculated the enemy, and therefore they can no longer trust in their own assessments of the enemy's psychology. And if that's true, if we misunderstood Hamas with catastrophic consequences, and we suddenly look north to Hezbollah, which has a much more powerful presence, much larger force, much larger ground forces, much larger missile arsenal, rocket arsenal, then Hezbollah can no longer be treated as deterred, which is how we've thought of them for the last 17 years. And if that's true, you extend that to the Iranian-led militias in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and you extend it to Iran itself. In other words, it is no longer a legitimate defensive doctrine to assume that the other side is deterred. And so I don't know where that goes. I mean, I know where that goes in Lebanon with Hezbollah. There's going to be a war. I think Hezbollah will start it. Frankly, I hope Hezbollah will start it. It'll be politically more comfortable for Israel, but Israel can't live with that threat any longer. But what it means for Iran, much larger and more dangerous situation.
Two more questions. I view the world as in two camps now, and it's Iran, Russia, and China is the big dog, and they're running it. And they're subsidizing Russia, and they're buying oil from Iran. And they all have proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah and North Korea, and that the West is opposite them. But that's clarity on my part. Is that view widely shared? Because when I was last in Israel, when I talked to Dr. Oren, there was some ambivalence about the Chinese Communist Party and doing business with them. Is that ambivalence resolving into a recognition that they are not your friend? I
think the Israeli take is very close to what you're describing, but not exactly. the Israeli understanding, as I understand it, and there are many different voices in the Israeli debate, but the basic sort of mainstream Israeli understanding is China wants to disrupt the American leadership of essentially the American liberal world order. It wants to disrupt it in ways that are going to be harmful to a lot of people all over the world, a lot of nations, a lot of the economy of the world. China is not supporting Iran because it hates us. It's supporting Iran because it's trying to hurt America. We are caught in that great power crossfire. In that great power crossfire, we are very eager and happy to be extremely useful allies of the United States. In other words, most Israelis treat the China-America sort of renewal of the Cold War, we'll call it, as a clarifying point. If, for example, we're losing the Democratic Party, well, what's the next Democratic president going to do? Turn against us while Iran is in China's pocket? So it is a clarifying, and it helps us sustain the American relationship, which we do think is strategic and big and important, and also emotionally important. Why am I saying that? I'm saying that because over the years, Israel has not minded getting close with China. China's a huge market. China wants our tech. America's been very upset with some Israeli tech sales and has actually asked Israel to limit its tech sales, and Israel has done so. But I think that is becoming, we're more clearly in the American camp than in the past, and that America-China war is something that Israel understands now, and of course, obviously, is very much in the American camp.
My last question has to do with Israeli politics. I have studiously avoided for a year commenting on the Supreme Court argument because I'm a constitutional law professor in the United States, and I don't care what foreigners think of our debates about our constitutional law and whether the court is off the rails or on the rail. I don't care what other people think because they don't know, and I don't know enough to have an opinion. But I've always liked Netanyahu and Likud running your country's politics. Here's my question. The political disagreements of the last year in Israel seem to me to be so deep that they cannot get out of the current argument about Hamas. That is, I hear in everyone's commentary some reflection of their view of Netanyahu and the court argument. Is it possible to get those separated for the period of the war ahead, or are they inextricably bound up?
I don't think the specific content of that argument that really tore us apart right up until October 7th, I don't think anyone's talking about that anymore. Nobody's talking about the powers of the Supreme Court. But that was also ultimately a debate about trust. When the Likud party presented its judicial reform back in January, 70% of Israelis supported some kind of judicial reform. There is a problem of a very powerful court. We do have to sort out what its powers are, what they are, and work in other checks and balances, that whole question. By the time Likud was 2 months in, its support for judicial reform, for the government's judicial reform, was down to 25%. They had lost half of their own voters. And so they had mishandled, never mind the substance. On the substance, most people agree in Israel, huge numbers of the left agree that we needed judicial reform. By the time they were done with the way they had presented it, they had shed so much political capital and so much trust because of how horribly they handled it. Netanyahu therefore went into this war with a huge trust deficit. He's also been the person who has been the most vocal in pushing the concept that Hamas is deterred and containable. And he owns it. He had a government in 2009 with the Labor Party, with Ehud Barak of the Labor Party, and he now has a government with the far-right, religious Zionism and Otzma Yehudit parties. He has had governments, he has led governments over the last 14 years with the left and the right. And all the governments had the same Gaza policy. In other words, this is Netanyahu's Gaza policy. And so he walks in with a trust deficit from that fight, and it does hang around his neck. And so there's a huge, trust question. We look at the polls. In the polls, Netanyahu plummeted to, I think his favorability for prime minister is at something like 20%. His own voters are turning to other leaders. So it's not that we're fighting the judicial reform fight, but the trust that was shed by how poorly it was handled, and then seeing how poorly Netanyahu's 15 years of Gaza policy essentially ended. That I think is affecting him and is still part of our politics. I mean, that's the basic truth is that Netanyahu probably doesn't survive this war.
That is my assumption as well. I don't make predictions about other countries' politics, but my last follow-up, Haviv, I was on the air for 10 hours on 9/11. And I had covered the Florida recount and the terrible Bush-Gore controversy, and the country was so deeply divided on 9/10. And on 9/12, it was a rock. And Democrats and Republicans were standing in front of the Capitol singing God Bless America. And that lasted for about a year and through the next election. I am afraid I don't hear that in the Israeli commentary, and I wonder how broken is Israeli politics. So tell me, give me some good news on that, please, that it's not broken, that it's just Netanyahu and that Likud is not out, that it's not broken forever.
No, it's all good news. On that narrow question, it's all good news. Oh, how much good news? To the point where optimism levels are up in the last 6 weeks. Israelis are in this terrible traumatic war. 360,000 people have been called up. About half the fathers of my neighborhood are gone. I spend a little bit of time in the reserves, but I'm very old now. I'm 42. Younger men are doing that work. And even though every family either knows somebody, every family, we have friends who have kidnapped children in Gaza that we're hoping will be out in the next 3 or 4 days. Every family knows somebody in Israel. And even though the trauma is very real and profound, we have this consistent survey that's been going for years of optimism, and optimism is up. Now, why is optimism up? To the vast majority of Israelis, on the left, on the right, activists on all sides, we have rediscovered our strength. We have rediscovered our unity. I read a wonderful op-ed in Arabic in an Arabic newspaper in the Galilee by an Arab-Israeli journalist who said the Jews have been reminded of a century ago by how closely this matched pogroms of a century ago, and the Jews have been reminded where they came from. The unity we're seeing is astonishing. Incidentally, Arab Israelis have the highest rates of identification with Israel. 72%, absolutely. The Druze community, the ultra-Orthodox community. It isn't just that hundreds of ultra-Orthodox Jews who did not believe religiously in military service have joined the army, have begged to volunteer for the army in the last 6 weeks. Hundreds of thousands, the entirety of the community, just about, well over 90% of the community supports those few hundred. In other words, not all of them are suddenly going to rush to the army, but they all support in principle, and this is brand new, ultra-Orthodox serving in the army. So there's a sense of solidarity, and it crosses ethnic lines and religious lines, and it's astonishing. All of civil society has woken up. Our government is a little bit incompetent. Our politics have really declined and deteriorated. Everything else in Israel was revealed to be strong and resilient, and now unified in a way that I have never seen.
On that note, I want to thank you again, Haviv Rettig. Follow him on X, the site formerly known as Twitter. Listen to him on the Times of Israel podcast and every Monday with Dan Senor. Please come back, Haviv. Stephanie was right. I was wrong years ago, and I continue to look forward to having you back. Thank you for joining me on a very, very important day in Israel's long and wonderful history. Thank you, Haviv Rettig.
Thank you for having me.